Thank you everyone for joining us for our In Conversation around art in the place of conflict as part of Derry Playhouse's seminar. My name is Mary Cremin. I am the director of Void Gallery. I am joined by Giles Duley, who's an English portrait and documentary photographer and writer. He's best known for his work documenting the long-term impact of war. He is CEO of the NGO Legacy of War Foundation and activist for the rights of those living with disabilities caused by conflict. So Giles is going to give us a presentation for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation about his work afterwards. Over to you, Giles.
Well, great, and thank you for having me. In these strange times when we're all kind of dispersed around, it's a shame we can't be all in the same room together, but I hope today is going to be an interesting conversation. And really, I wanted to explore my own journey as a photographer from just really making images to realizing that those images could actually have a direct impact on the people that I was working with. And really it starts with a moment that happened in an exhibition once. I had an exhibition in London and I had various images that I'd done of conflicts around the world, and somebody walked in and they started looking around at my photographs, and almost angrily they came over to me and pointing at my images, they said, "Do you think your photographs can change the world?" And I said, "Well, no, I don't. But I do believe they can inspire the person that can." And that's how I used to think about my work. To put it a little bit into context, many years ago, I'm a conflict photographer, or I cover the effects of conflict. And I decided that I needed to start putting my work together as a single body of work. And I called that Legacy of War, because I was interested not necessarily in the narratives of single conflicts, but I was interested in what kind of related to each one. I realized that I could be in Cambodia listening to a story about the Khmer Rouge. I could be in Afghanistan. I could be in Syria. And when I shut my eyes and just listened to the stories, they were identical. And I realized that too often we talk about conflicts kind of in isolation rather than looking at the common themes. So that was a project I set up called Legacy of War. And it was while doing that project in 2011 that I was in Afghanistan. And I myself was injured by a landmine. I lost both my legs and my arm. And for over a year, I couldn't work. I couldn't do any photography. And it really seemed like my project or my photographic work was over. But miraculously, thanks to the great doctors and surgeons and medical teams, I was able to return to work. And now it felt more important than ever to focus on this idea of legacy of war, because quite literally I had walked in the footsteps of the people that I've been documenting. And the first project I decided to do after my recovery was in Lebanon. And it was about Syrian refugees, some of Syria's most vulnerable refugees, the elderly, single parent families, and those living with disabilities such as myself. So I went there, say, in 2013, 2 years after my injury, and I started to photograph people like Khulud. Now, Khulud had been at home in Syria. She had a small garden. She was growing vegetables as the area was under siege. And when she was in her garden that day, a sniper shot her in the neck. She was immediately paralyzed, tetraplegic. She actually fell on top of one of her own children. Her family managed to get her emergency medical treatment, and then they escaped to Lebanon, where she got some further treatment. But when I met her, she was living in a makeshift tent in the Bekaa Valley. And when I say a makeshift tent, it literally was made of bits of plastic, bits of cardboard, even film posters that had been ripped down off billboards to make the roof. If you imagine a woman paralyzed from the neck down, lying in a makeshift tent, the only care and support she got was from her husband, Jamal. I think it was one of the most desperate situations I'd ever seen. In the summer, it was so incredibly hot, there were no windows. In the winter, it was below freezing. And yet she was this incredibly positive, strong woman. I remember asking her, "What is your one hope for the future?" And Khulud said, "I just want to be a mother again." On this trip, I met many other people with similar stories. I met a woman called Reem. Reem had been at home in Syria when a missile hit her house. Her husband was actually killed in the bed next to her. She lost both of her legs, and one of her children died that night. when I met her, she was living on the top floor of an unfinished building, again in Beirut's Bekaa Valley. Because she was just getting used to her prosthetic legs, she couldn't get up and down the stairs. She was quite literally trapped on this rooftop. The only person that lived with her was her father, Abdel. Now, if you go online and you look at my photographs, you will see all my photographs. I use this white sheet as a sort of backdrop, and people are always looking directly at the camera in these portraits. But Abdel is the only picture where he's not looking directly at the camera. We were on this rooftop, and I would go to take his photograph, and I would say, look at me. And as I was about to take the image, he would kind of look out to the side. And I'd be like, no, look at me. And this kept going on. It became almost kind of a joke that every time I was about to take the picture, he'd suddenly look away. And eventually I said to him, we were on this rooftop, I said, why do you keep looking, in the distance when I'm about to take your photograph? And he pointed to these mountains that we could see from this rooftop. And he said, you see the mountains? I said, yes. And he said, those mountains are Syria. He goes, I'm an old man. I will probably never return home, which is why I live on this rooftop. Because the first thing I see in the morning and the last thing I see at night is my homeland. And so actually the only picture I've ever took of anybody not looking directly at my camera in a portrait is the picture of Abdel, where he is looking out to his home and the mountains. Also on this trip, I met a young girl called Aya. Aya, when I first met her, I actually thought I shouldn't take her photograph. I don't like to show people as victims of circumstance, but not to sort of portray them as victims. But with Aya, I was really struggling when I was introduced to her, again, in Lebanon, in a refugee camp. She was in this very sort of muddy tent. It was wet. She was on the floor. She has spina bifida, meaning she can't sit up on her own. She was 4 years old. And I thought, gosh, if I take her photograph, she would just look like this victim. It was really a horrific situation. So I said to the family, look, I won't take any photographs, but I would like to spend the day and just, spend some time with the family. Well, it turned out, and not for the first time in my life, that I was actually completely and utterly wrong about this young girl called Aya. She was actually the feistiest, strongest 4-year-old I've ever met in my life. I soon discovered that she didn't just run her family, she ran the whole refugee camp. Her sister walked in to this muddy tent, and Aya looked up at her and said, Aman, and Aman looked down and said, hey, donkey, pick me up. And so Aman would pick her up, and then we'd walk around this refugee camp, and she would say to somebody, hey, donkey, give me the bread. And somebody would hand her bread, and hey, donkey, give me water. And somebody would give her water. And so she was this incredibly feisty character. And after weeks of visiting, I finally managed to get this picture that really encapsulated her spirit, which is her playing hopscotch with her sister. And as I say, that's how I like to try and show people. We have this idea of refugee camps, of people in post-conflict communities, and of being victims. And actually, what I tend to find is all the things we expect, humor, laughter, people sharing food, the strength, the resilience of people. And that is what I try and show in my photographs. Now, this trip had been particularly important for me because it was the first time I'd really worked since my own accident. And when I came back, the pictures were published, and it was a sort of milestone in rebuilding my own life, having lost my legs and my arm. And it was a really important time for me. So I was feeling quite pleased with myself. I felt I'd done my job. As I said at the beginning of this talk, I felt my job was to put the pictures out there, and those photographs would inspire people to create change. Now, a couple of years later, I went back to Lebanon. I was there doing a project for the UNHCR, the refugee agency. And I decided when I was there that I should go back and revisit some of the families that I'd met 2 years before. So I went, I managed to find Reem, who was living on the rooftop still with her father, Abdel. But she now had quite a few other members of her family living with her. Life had returned somewhat to normalcy, as normal as it can be for a refugee. I remember asking her daughter, Sarah, who is now living with her, who are your favorite friends at school? Tell me about the subjects you like. And she said, well, I don't go to school and I have no friends. She was trapped on this rooftop, and like many families, denied education, denied access to healthcare, unable to work. I managed to track down, of course, Aya and her family. She was as feisty as ever. I got this great photograph of her being pushed in a wheelchair by her brother. And as I was taking the photograph, she was screaming, faster, donkey, faster. But again, like Reem's family, unable to get healthcare. When Aya was sick, they couldn't take her to the hospital. Her parents were unable to work. It was illegal for them to work. And the kids, her brothers and sisters, couldn't go to school. Now, I managed to find most of the people that I photographed on my previous visit, but obviously some had moved, some had changed numbers, some I had no contact information for. And on the last day, I had a phone call. And it's a phone call that has kind of stayed with me, and a phone call that changed my life completely. It was a phone call from Jamal, Khulud's husband, Khulud, the woman who'd been paralyzed by a sniper's bullet. And I got this phone call, and it's Jamal, and he said, "We hear you're back in Lebanon. We'd love to see you." And I said, "Great. You know, I've been trying to track everyone down. I didn't know where you were. Of course, I can come in the morning. Where are you?" And he said, "We're in the same place you last saw us." And I remember like I'd been punched in the stomach. I felt kind of physically sick. I thought, well, wait a minute, where are you now though? And he said, "The same place." And I hadn't even bothered to look for them there because I thought of all the people I'd met 2 years before, nobody was in more desperate need than Khulud, this woman living in a makeshift tent, paralyzed from the neck down. And I just thought there was no way she could possibly be in that same place. And this is where maybe the arrogance of being a photographer and a journalist, I thought, well, I told the story. It had been published around the world. Surely something would have changed. I thought I'd done my job. So I went to see them the next morning, and I walked into the tent and I actually burst into tears. And I looked at Khulud and I said, "I failed you." I said, "You trusted me with your story and I failed you. You know, you're still in this situation." Now, Khulud is like an angel. She just is the most calm, wonderful person you could ever meet. And she just smiled and she says, "Okay, we knew you'd come back." But in my own heart, I questioned the whole point of what I do. Why be a photographer? Why, you know, call yourself an activist and you do all this stuff if it actually makes no difference to the most desperately in need person you've ever met. I decided the only thing I could really do in that situation was to try and take more photographs and do their story in a better way. It was the only thing I really knew how to do. And so I spent the next sort of week documenting their daily life. I mean, it's amazing. This house where they were, it's not a house. I mean, it was just this sort of room. I must say, it had no windows. If you imagine, for 2 years since I'd last seen her, she had not moved from the bed, staring at the same bit of ceiling. She had not seen daylight. There's this tiny little area in the corner, which is where they cook. The children have to sleep on the floor, so she has no dignity. She has no privacy. And yet it's a place full of love and laughter. And, you know, it always makes me laugh. Her husband, Jamal, when we're in the kitchen, he'll sort of whisper to me his greatest fear. And his greatest fear is that she does not love him as much as he loves her. I mean, it's a really incredibly uplifting home to be in. I often take photographs with me to give back to people that I photographed before. And I've been doing that with Aya and Reem and these other people that I'd met. And in my bag, I had the photograph that I'd taken of Khulud and Jamal 2 years before, of them, Khulud on the bed and Jamal sat at the end of the bed holding her hand. And as I was sat there on the last day of my visit, I wasn't sure whether to give them that photograph because I looked down and I realized the photograph that I had in my bag taken 2 years before was exactly the same as the scene in front of me. And I thought, well, if I give them this photograph, won't it just remind them that nothing's changed? Won't it remind them that they are stuck in this terrible, terrible situation? But I thought, no, I have to give it to them. And I took the photograph out, and for me, it's a beautiful photograph of this couple. And before I gave it to Khulud, I said, when I took this photograph, I did not take a photograph of a disabled woman. I did not take a photograph of a refugee. I took a photograph of a couple who are so in love with each other. And this photograph for me is a photograph of love. And I gave them this image, and you know, it was a very emotional time, and I left that day and headed back to the UK. But something had clicked in my mind. I realized it was no longer just enough for me to be somebody that documented. I had to be more active about what I did with these images. I would never allow it to happen again in my life, that I would come back and find somebody's situation had not changed because of them sharing their story with me. And I realized that as a photographer, it's not enough just to record a story. You have to make sure people hear it. So it was a few weeks later, I was actually in San Francisco. I was doing a talk there, and I was telling the story of Khulud and Jamal. And I linked up there with an American actor called Misha Collins, who runs a yearly sort of fundraiser with his sort of fans and community. And we decided to use Khulud's story. And so we did a crowdfunding campaign. And I didn't really talk about the Syrian war. I didn't talk about the refugees. I merely told a love story of Khulud and Jamal. And within the space of 1 week, we raised $250,000 to support them, which meant that we didn't just support them, we were actually able to rehouse many, many families in Lebanon. I mean, this was 5 years ago. We still have families that we've managed to rehouse. And so that was, again, a huge turning point for me in realizing what you could actually do with a photograph. Up to that point, I thought my role was to get it published in the Sunday Times, to get it in the New York Times. Actually, isn't it more important if I could put it in front of the right people and get something to actually directly happen? But I wanted to do more. You know, it felt, again, that I really had to work with people. You know, I always say that as a photographer, I'm a guardian of other people's stories. You know, that really I am just there to reflect what their stories is, but how could I get them even more involved? A couple of years later, after campaigning, I was able to get Khulud's family rehoused in Holland. They were relocated there and able to start a second life. And then a few months later, I had an exhibition in Geneva alongside Lake Geneva. And in that exhibition, it included photographs of Khulud, Aya, Reem, and the other people we've been talking about. And I decided what I had to do for the opening was to invite Khulud to be there and to open the exhibition. So it was quite tricky. She is in a wheelchair, and a lot of the flights wouldn't take her. But eventually we managed to find a way for her to come and to be there and to open the exhibition. And really that was the point when my sort of transition was complete, because to me, that was what work should be about as a photographer. It's about helping people to tell their own stories. I hate this phrase where people say, you give voice to people. I don't give voice to people. They have voices. My job is to make sure their voice is heard. And the ultimate way for me to do that was actually to have Khulud there at the exhibition where her images were, for her to introduce it and for her to talk about the work. And so, you know, really I'm trying to sort of, you know, explain my own, say, personal journey. I think as creatives and artists, it's very easy to feel that our job is simply to put the story out there, is simply to tell the story. And I think in the world that we live in, where there is so much noise and so much stuff going on, I realized that I had to do more. I mean, I started this talk by referring to this moment when somebody came into one of my exhibitions, where they looked at one of my photographs and they said, do you think you can change the world? And I said, no, I hope it can inspire the person that can. And I realize now that that wasn't the right answer. That was a kind of get out clause. That was saying I'm not responsible for what happens. And so what I would say is, ironically, it actually turned out that the person that I inspired by these stories was actually myself. In the end, I inspired myself that I had to become an activist, that I had to become actively involved in making sure that when somebody shared their story with me, I made sure that the world heard it, but also acted on it. Thank you.
What I found really interesting when I was looking at your website was the kind of narrative stories that you had written about them. So do you obviously write that as well from a very personal point of view of their story?
You know, again, I think one of these things that's interesting is, as a journalist, as a photographer, you're sort of taught to be slightly impartial. You know, you're supposed to have a slight distance. And, you know, I realized that actually I'm not really, I would never refer to myself as a photojournalist. I believe a photojournalist has a role as a slightly impartial viewer. I would say I'm an angry man with a camera, you know, and I create images and tell stories because I want something to actually change, something to happen. And so, you know, I discovered, actually by doing talks and events like this, that by telling the story around the image, people connected with it in a very different way. It became a personal story that people then, you know, associated with. And so I kind of went maybe against what my training was, or how I thought I should be, which was to write this more personal accounts of the stories of the people that I meet.
Yeah, because in most photojournalism, you kind of, when you see things in the media, I think even especially, I think it was 2 nights ago, they had images of refugees in Greece after the big fire in the. So you have these images that are put out in the world, But then the news story kind of moves on, where it seems like you tend to build relationships with which they're not your subjects as such, they're probably more colleagues.
No, they become friends, and as I say, I think there's a responsibility. I think one of the things I feel is, a story doesn't end when we leave. And I keep trying to say that to young photographers and journalists is, we use these sort of phrase, I've done the story or I've finished the project. But actually for the people in those stories, it hasn't finished. They are still living that experience, whether it be living with injuries, living as refugees, their story continues. And what I discovered is, somebody like Khulud, I would go back and say, well, I'm going to go back and do the story again. And the people that I would be working with, whether it be newspapers, magazines, or agencies, would be like, well, we've done that story. We've done it. And I would say, but she's still in that situation. So we need to keep telling the story. And so, that's something that, Khulud's story I've been telling for 8-9 years now and documenting her life and many other families. And yeah, again, that goes against this idea of constantly trying to find new stories, new angles, as opposed to maybe looking in depth at somebody's life. And I do find that very difficult when, I see exactly the kind of images you're talking about of, the camps in Greece, and you're like, who are these people? Yes, I see pictures of people running from the fires. I see people sleeping on the side of the road, but who are they? They're sort of, in that sense, they become, of course, we need to know what's happening, but I feel like I want to know more about who these people are. And, as somebody, living with my own injuries caused by conflict, I know that they can often overshadow me. And so, I become the amputee photographer or the photographer with disability first, before anybody really knows who I am as a person. And I think, again, that's something that's really important to do with the kind of stories around conflict, is for that person, their identity is a far more nuanced and subtle thing. Something tragic happened to them, or they were caught up in a conflict, but that shouldn't define them. And I think it's quite a difficult thing to do in journalism and photography and storytelling, but it's really essential that we can find that element, because I think that's where we find our shared humanity.
Yeah, I think often the problem is that as a news story, let's say what happened in Beirut a couple of weeks ago, is a story in its forefront, but then the news media move on, and then the people are left with the debris and the legacy of what's happened them through wars and everything else. So it's important for people to see that legacy. I guess even in here in Derry, where there's consistently dealing with the legacy, even though it's, we've had the peace process and we've had a lot of things have changed politically, but people are still dealing with the legacy of the conflict. So it's not something that just moves on. It might move on in the media, but not within people's lives.
Absolutely. I've done a lot of work in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos, where people are still feeling the impact of what happened during the Vietnam War. 126,000 people have been physically injured since the Vietnam War ended, from sort of leftover munitions and bombs. But the psychological impact goes on and on. I remember talking to a guy in Cambodia once, and he sort of described PTSD in the most eloquent way from somebody that didn't understand what PTSD was. He'd never seen a psychologist, he'd never heard of anything like PTSD. But I remember talking to him about the traumas that he had suffered during the war and said, does it still affect you? Is that something? And he kind of just shook it off. And then as I was leaving, he came up to me and he said, I thought about what you said. And he said, it's true. He said, sometimes when I'm happy, I have dreams about my past nightmares. And I thought that was such an eloquent and powerful way to describe that legacy. And, this was somebody talking 50 years after something had happened. Yeah. So sadly, and I think it can also go down generations. And yeah, we're living in such a kind of fast moving world of everybody. What's the next story? What's the next story? What's the next story? That we don't take the time to consider the stories that are there in front of us that continue.
I guess that really kind of shows the power of the image as well, which is something that's always been quite prevalent within photography, or this notion of truth telling, of seeing the truth within an image.
Yeah, I think there's no truth in photography, interestingly, in some ways. I remember being on one of the border crossings between Greece and Macedonia during the height of the sort of refugee exodus through Europe. And the border had just been shut. And there were a couple of thousand people who had suddenly been stuck on the border. Within that couple of thousand people, there were a couple of hundred, maybe younger men that were quite angry and sort of pushing the fences, etc. Now, I knew what would happen, and it did. The world's media kind of descended on that spot because they were going to get those dramatic images of young men trying to push fences down, Macedonian police firing tear gas. It was the kind of images that we see all over the media. Unfortunately, that plays into a lot of people's fears, a lot of people's anger, but they're very dramatic images. Now, if you were to say there were about 2,000 people, maybe 200 people were rioting. I was sat in a tent with a Yemeni family having tea, and they were terrified themselves of these people rioting. Now, what is the truth? Well, the truth is both things. You know, there were people rioting, so that was something that was happening, that wasn't a lie. But it was also the truth that the majority of people were sat there peacefully, hoping for it to end. So you could say both of those things were true. But what I would say is that what you can be is honest. And I think as a journalist and as somebody working in those places, what you have to try and be is honest. And for me, you know, the honest interpretation of what was happening in that place on that day was peaceful. You know, the fact that a very small minority of people were causing trouble, but you had every single newspaper covering that, and that was the front pages of every newspaper. And the reality is the newspapers are not going to have on the cover a picture of a Yemeni family having a cup of tea. Yeah. You know, that's the reality. But I think my job always has been to reflect what I see as what's happening in a place. But that often means, you know, you go against the grain. I remember somebody from the UN once describing my images, and they were, I think, saying it in a positive way, but they praised my work for showing the banality of life. And, you know, that is often the reality of these things. But unfortunately, we're led by a media and I guess by consumers, you know, it works both ways, that want this kind of drama.
Mm. And then with your portraits, you've made a decision, obviously, to not have any background. And so it's white, so you're just making this a singular portrait of a person, but also in black and white, which is a very classical use of portrait photography. So that, in a way, does that make it humanizes them, I guess, and doesn't put them in a situation that's...
Yeah, I mean, it's a couple of things. One is, I think it creates a timeless image, because again, I'm kind of looking at this idea, as you mentioned, that these things are not just about the here and now. These are stories that go on forever. And, you know, you can look at images and then think, well, is this recent? Is this from a while ago? But also, yeah, there is that sense of dignity. You know, it's if you're photographing a family and they're living in a tent, and, you know, I often see it with the mothers kind of embarrassed about the state of everything. And actually, when you say to somebody, right, we're going to put this white sheet up and I'm going to photograph you in this way, you can see people kind of, a smile comes to their face, because it feels like you're treating them in a different way. And it's actually often becomes a really fun occasion. You know, I was doing a story of women who had escaped from violence in DR Congo. And, you know, we arranged to do it, and the next day I turned up and they got some batteries for the radio, and they had music playing, and it became a party actually to do these portraits. And for me, that's great, because it should be something that can also be celebrated, rather than, you know, again, I was, I guess, quite unique in that I have photographed people who've been injured, and I myself was photographed after I got injured in Afghanistan, minutes after I got injured. So I know what it's like to have somebody point a camera at you at your worst moment in your life. And, you know, it's not a very dignified thing, and it's a very traumatic thing. I think it's important. I think we need to see the realities of that. But if I can also do images that become something of maybe a moment of release, and to give people that dignity, then that's something that I'm very conscious of doing.
Great. Well, I think we've run out of time, but I want to thank you, Giles, on behalf of the Playhouse, and for everybody listening in. It's been great to talk to you, and I believe you're off to Beirut and Lebanon, so that's...
And we'll be seeing some of those families again.
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, I'll go to your website and see how it develops. So for anyone else who's interested, it's www.legacyofwar.com, is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, well,
thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, lovely to meet you. Okay, take care.